Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Michael Feltner, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of Seaver College. I appreciate you joining us for the second lecture in the 2016-2017 W. David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series. The 2016 presidential election has certainly been fascinating, and I am excited that our honored guest, Dr. Erika Fowler, will share her insights from the Wesleyan Project on political advertising in the current election with us this evening. So Erika, we're aware that Election Day is less than 2 weeks away and are deeply appreciative that you made the time to be with us during this very hectic time for you. So thank you, and we look forward to your presentation. Before beginning this evening's program, it's my pleasure to welcome the Dean Emeritus of Seaver College and the individual for whom our lecture series is named, Dean David Baird. David, would you stand so we can acknowledge you? Our format for this evening is as follows. After Dr. Fowler's presentation, we will take a very brief break for those who have a 6 o'clock class and need to excuse themselves. Following that brief intermission, we will continue with a question and answer session. And then after the Q&A, there'll be an opportunity if you wish to purchase Erika's book. You can purchase it here, and we'll also have a book signing. Introducing our speaker this evening is Professor of Mathematics and Associate Dean, Dr. Kendra Kilpatrick. Kendra is a gifted educator, she has a fan, scholar, and administrator. Kendra cares deeply about student learning and student success. She's a passionate advocate for faculty and is leading efforts to improve pedagogy, support faculty development through mentoring, improve cultural competency through the SEED program, and build community across Seaver College. Kendra publishes frequently in the area of combinatorics. And if being a faculty member and associate dean were not enough, Kendra combines her passion for students in mathematics by serving as the associate director of the Budapest Semester in Mathematics program. The BSM program provides a unique opportunity for students who are serious about mathematics, direct quote, to have an intensive math-based educational experience while immersed in the Hungarian culture. Our honored guest this evening was a participant in the BSM program, and this makes Kendra the ideal individual to introduce Dr. Fowler. Kendra.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here this evening and to welcome Dr. Franklin Fowler to Pepperdine and to Seaver College. Dr. Franklin Fowler graduated summa cum laude from St. Olaf College with a double major in political science and mathematics. She spent 2 years at the University of Michigan as a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research, and 5 years as the director of the University of Wisconsin New Lab, one of the largest and most systematic tracking projects for local TV ever conducted. Dr. Franklin Fowler earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and is currently an associate professor of government at Wesleyan University, where she directs the Wesleyan Media Project. The Wesleyan Media Project tracks and analyzes all political ads aired on broadcast television in real time during elections, so this is an extremely busy time for her. Her academic specialty is political communication, and she has published her work on local political coverage in journals of political science, communication, law, and medicine. She has extensive experience conducting surveys and focus groups, and she serves on the ABC News Election Night Decision Desk, so you may look for her on election night. We are so pleased during this busy season to welcome Dr. Franklin Fowler.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out on a busy night during the middle of the semester. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today. I wanted to briefly acknowledge my two co-directors for the Wesleyan Media Project, one at Bowdoin College and one at Washington State University, Michael Franz and Travis Ridout. And because I'm going to be talking to you about advertising and in particular unlimited amounts of money, the very first thing that I need to do is to be completely transparent about where our funding comes from. So this project and my talk is very proudly brought to you by funding made available by Wesleyan University and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. We've also received funds from other foundations in the past, and we partner in particular with OpenSecrets.org, the Center for Responsive Politics, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So our advertising data, so as Kendra kindly mentioned, we track all ads that air on broadcast television and national cable in real time during elections. And this data is available for purchase with anybody who has enough deep pockets to purchase them. So read the candidates, the other parties, and organized interest groups who want to know what the other side is doing, they can purchase this data. The data comes from a company called Kantar Media, CMAG, and what they provide to us is what I'll call the frequency database. So in the frequency database, they have servers in each of the 210 media markets in the United States. And each of those servers recognize the digital seams in programming, so they know when advertising starts. And then the technology, every ad that airs in the United States has what I'll call a unique sound wave pattern. So the technology will listen for that sound wave, and it will, based on what it hears, either identify this is an ad I've seen before, in which case I'm just going to log the instance, or this is an ad that I have not seen before, and therefore I'm going to record it and log the instance. And so we get from them is a frequency database that tells us where, and down to the second, each ad aired across the country. So I quickly pulled some presidential advertising from California media markets. You'll notice over here on the air dates that I had to go back to May, mostly, to find some that are airing, although you do have Next Gen Climate Action Committee is doing some advertising here, primarily on Spanish networks. So if you were watching Univision or other networks like that, you may have come across some recent presidential advertising. But for the most part, the presidential candidates weren't up on air after the primaries. But it tells you which ad aired, in which market it aired, the station, the affiliate. It'll tell us the program, so Jimmy Kimmel Live in this instance, the air date, and then the second, down to the second in which it aired. Then students at Wesleyan University and Bowdoin College and Washington State University will log on to what I call an online coding tool. So it looks similar to this. And they will they have a queue of ads, they'll hit a button, an ad will pop up, they'll watch the ad, and they'll answer a whole series of questions. It's on the order of 250 variables that we track for every single ad. So this is a quick screenshot of our issue battery, and it's tough to read, but we track mentions of issues and ads. So these are our economic policy batteries. So we're looking at taxes, deficit, government spending, recession, all those things. We have social issues, defense issues, social welfare sorts of things. So we can tell you who is talking about what sorts of issues in which races. We don't just track presidential. We get data all the way down to dog catcher. If a dog catcher were ever to air a television ad, we would capture that. Our students, however, only code in real time the federal advertising, so President, US House, US Senate, and then we also do gubernatorial ads. So the data that we collect from that project include the sponsor, so whether or not a candidate is sponsoring the ad, a political party, or an interest group. And there's actually a fourth category because parties and candidates can coordinate an ad. So if you have an ad, there aren't any in the presidential cycle this year, but if you had an ad by Donald Trump and the RNC, that would go into a fourth category called coordinated. We track tone, so is the ad positive, negative, or contrast? And as I was saying earlier, this is not a subjective measure. We define an attack ad as an ad that, except for the paid-for byline, where you might have, I'm Hillary Clinton and I approve this message, you focus only on Donald Trump. That would be qualified in our categorization as pure attack. A positive ad, by contrast, would be an ad that talks only about the favored candidate. If an opponent is mentioned outside of the paid-for byline, that, therefore, is a contrast ad. And we do this because it's a very objective definition, right? Because you can imagine there are lots of ads, and we see lots of ads, that feel very negative, but then at the end close with, and I'll fight for you. That actually would be a positive ad, even though it feels somewhat negative. There also are positive ads positive feeling ads, and Clinton has one, Obama has had some in the past, where it's bright colors, the candidate speaking directly into the camera, but if they mention their opponent, Donald Trump or Mitt Romney, that would qualify in our definition as a contrast ad because it is providing a contrast between the two. We track issue themes. We track whether or not an ad is primarily about the personal characteristics of a candidate or primarily about policy, or a combination of both. We look at major politician mentions. So we can tell you, for example, that right now, outside of the presidential ads, more Republican Senate ads are going after and mentioning Hillary Clinton than Democratic Senate ads are going after and mentioning Donald Trump. So usually what we're looking for in that category is mentions of an incumbent president. But this year we have seen quite a few ads that are discussing the presidential candidates themselves. We track mentions of party affiliation. Not surprisingly, if you think a little bit about it, most ads don't mention party, right? Because political advertising is playing to people at the center, and they assume that partisanship is not going to help them. So in many cases, there are reasons to obfuscate and not actually mention party names. We also look at emotional appeals. So is this ad intended to convey sadness or anger or frustration or enthusiasm? What sort of music is being played? I wish, as a graduate of St. Olaf College, I wish I could tell you that this was a sophisticated music battery. But we didn't think that our coders would necessarily know the difference between major and minor chords. So we track things like, is it ominous or is it uplifting? We also look at voiceovers. So I can tell you that political ads, even in the year 2016, are dominated by men's voices. I'm not quite sure why. I can tell you a little bit about research that we've done on that front, but it's not necessarily obvious that men's voices will always work better, and so it's an interesting phenomenon that we see. Okay, so before I talk to you about 2016 and what we're seeing, I thought it would be useful to set the stage a little bit and give you some trends that we have seen in political advertising prior to 2016. So what do we know? Well, the first thing that we know is that advertising, even in the age of the internet, has really only been going up. So you see the presidential ad cycle, 2012 was a record pulverizing year for political advertising. We just had never, ever seen anything like it. The other thing that's really interesting, if you contrast 2008 with 2012, is that in 2008, Barack Obama ran what I would classify as a pretty national campaign. He aired ads mostly everywhere. In 2012, both sides recognized that this was going to be a hyper-competitive race, and the gloves came off, and all of the ads were concentrated into very few places. So we not only saw many, many, many more ads, right, into 2012, especially on the presidential side, but they were concentrated into a few particular places. So if you live in Las Vegas, or if you live in Denver, Colorado, you were getting blasted with ads. There was not a single ad air spot left to be purchased by Election Day. On congressional, we've also tended to see a trend going upwards. You'll see 2014 being perhaps the plateau, right? So the open question going into 2016 was 2012 going to be the high watermark for television ads? Certainly, we are seeing more money going into digital. We are seeing more money also going into what I'll call local cable buys. So we track local broadcast, and we track national cable. But inside of every hour of cable programming, there's roughly 2 minutes of time that can be purchased at the local level. So in Middletown, Connecticut, I can tell you that's where I will see, if you're watching CNN, I will see our local Wow Fitness gym ad airing on CNN. Those are the local cable spots. There isn't a lot of inventory there, but it can be a more efficient buy for candidates. And so we are seeing more of that, but we can't track it the same way that we can track local broadcast. So that's part of what is certainly going on there. But again, the open question was where we were going to be this cycle. Advertising still is today a very, very large part of federal candidate budgets. So if we look at all Senate candidates from 2012 and 2014, the average budget for television advertising is somewhere around 30 to 35% of the total funds raised, right? And you see there's a lot of variation in there. So some candidates are spending 90% of their budget on television advertising. And the reason is, right, you're hitting a large swath of people with each spot. If you're buying an ad online, you're buying each one of those ads individually at a much, much, much lower cost. television is, by its very definition, bigger audience and bigger cost. And so that's the reason why it still today consumes most of a campaign budget. So the next obvious question has to be more ads, more spending, right? Television advertising must be profoundly influential, right? Well, I'll put a big question mark on that, right? Because it actually has never been the case that advertising was a silver bullet. And what I mean by that is that advertising, if you have a candidate who is not necessarily resonating with the public, right, and already getting, say, 20 to 30% of the vote, no amount of spending and no amount of advertising is going to take that candidate over the victory line. That simply is outside of the realm of possibility of advertising, always has been. And you don't have to look any further than Jeb Bush in this cycle to see that that's true. So these are airings in the darker bars and spending in the lighter bars for each of the candidates. And this is just before South Carolina when Jeb Bush dropped out. And what's interesting is that if I had backed up the timeline a little bit earlier, right? So if I'd given you data through January, Bush would have been totally dominating. It wasn't until the last few weeks that Rubio really came close. But you see that Bush, right, out-aired everyone. And he way outspent everyone. And part of the reason for the spending, and I can talk more about this in Q&A if you're interested, is in part because outside interest groups were airing most of his ads, and outside groups pay a lot more for every spot that they air than candidates do. But anyway, advertising is never, ever, ever going to be a silver bullet. That doesn't mean that advertising is not influential, right? But what I would characterize and what we have always known about advertising is that advertising matters at the margin. So if we're trying to assess what the actual effects of advertising are, there are several creative ways to do that, and I'm happy to talk about the mechanics for anybody who's really interested in how we go about estimating it. But I will tell you that roughly in a presidential race, we estimate that advertising is never really more than a percentage point, right? So you can move numbers a percentage point in either direction, but that probably is about the extent of the advertising effectiveness. Now, key to that 1%, however, is that we tend to assume candidates are equal and campaigns are equal, right? And so in a competitive presidential race, what we tend to see are two candidates that are evenly matched on air. We have not seen that this cycle, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But under those circumstances, we expect advertising to be roughly 1%, to be able to move numbers 1%. In Senate races, there can be more influential, and we expect that as advertising would go down ballot, we should see more effects because advertising is intended to help candidates who are unknown, okay? But to say that advertising matters at the margin doesn't mean that advertising doesn't matter, right? And you don't have to go further than Al Gore in 2000 to know what I mean, that advertising at the margin can matter, right? In a very competitive election cycle, sometimes you are competing for every last percentage point. And it's for that reason that you tend to see, and still do see today, candidates not taking any chances. Even though Hillary Clinton is leading in the polls, she continues to be up on air and she's expanding her advertising targeting. So what do we know about what makes ads effective? Well, there have been lots of studies on this, and I'm happy to talk about other things, but several things that we do know matter is that average people and the use of average people in advertising does tend to correlate with more effectiveness. And so what you'll often see, and my students will say this, the field of political science tends to focus on elites and elite endorsements. But if you watch ads for any length of time, what you're going to see is that it's mostly average people who are talking on camera and speaking about their experiences and what the candidates have done for them. And it does turn out that that does tend to correlate with better ads. So this screenshot on the left here is from an ad called Stage, which we partner with a company called Ace Metrics that tests ads in real time. So as they go up on air, they put the ad up with a 500-person national sample, and they test the ad. And this Stage ad was the highest scoring ad from their database in 2012, and it featured this gentleman called Mike Ernest, who talks about, one day we were asked to come and build a stage. So we bit 50 guys and we built that stage. And then he says, several days later, some men come up on that stage and they get up there and they say, this this factory is closing down. You're all out of a job. And he says, I turned to my left and I turned to my right, and we all just lost our jobs. He said, and Mitt Romney, right, is responsible for this. He earned lots of money doing this, and he says the closing line of the ad is it felt like when we were building that stage, we were putting a nail in our own coffin, right? Very powerful spot. Some ads like that for this cycle also feature, this is an ad by Priorities USA that featured a little girl with disabilities, and they have the opening shot is of her parents talking about her as a child, and then it goes on to show Donald Trump, of course, as everyone has seen, mocking the reporter with disabilities. The other thing that we know that is very powerful and very influential, which I'll talk about in just a minute, are ads that are aired by outside groups. And there are several reasons why outside group ads matter more, which I'll give you more insight into in a moment. Additional trends, we've seen only increasing negativity. So the dashed line is presidential ads and the solid line is congressional ads, and you see in general, over the past 16 years for which we have data, we've really only seen negativity increase, right? Part of that is due to increased competition, but also part of it has to do with outside groups, which do tend to be more negative. But the one thing I want to be sure that I highlight is that negativity is not always bad, right? We know that citizens, and if I were to ask you all who hates negative ads, I bet most of you would say, you know, they're horrible, they're terrible. Well, the one thing I need to be sure to impress upon you is that from a political science perspective, actually, negative ads are super important for democracy. Most citizens don't actually pay very much attention to politics. And all of you, by the very nature of you being in this room, already pay more attention to politics than the average citizen, right? But if you're a citizen who doesn't pay very much attention to politics, sometimes you need a wake-up call about why you should actually go out and vote, right? And so appeals to fear, appeals to anger, appeals that, you know, make you a little nervous are actually very helpful in encouraging you to go out and get more information and to seek out additional information. And so what I'd like to do is contrast typical positive ads with typical negative ads to give you a better flavor for that. And I chose a couple from a Wisconsin Senate race in 2010. So challenger Republican Ron Johnson at the time ends up defeating Senator Feingold from Wisconsin. They're actually in a rematch right now for any of you who follow Wisconsin politics. But here are two classic ads by Republican Ron Johnson. The first one I'm going to play you is positive, and it's intended to be a parody of a positive ad. But let's watch it, and then we'll talk about it for a moment.
Introducing the Ron Johnson family.
He's a really super dad.
He's a great role model.
He's worked extremely hard all his life. A wonderful husband for 33 years.
Okay, that's enough. Obviously, I'm not a professional politician, and they're not professional actors. We're just a Wisconsin family worried about our country. I'm Ron Johnson, and I approve this message, because it's time to get our nation's house in order.
So it's not your typical positive ad. So I usually joke about it when I'm wearing an appropriate outfit, but your typical positive ad has a candidate with a blue shirt and khaki pants walking through a park, and invariably, right, there's a Labrador. What do you learn from that ad? That the candidate has a family, and they like dogs, right? Who doesn't, unless you're a cat lover? So Ron Johnson actually takes a parody on a positive ad, but what did you learn from it? What do you know about him and his policies? He cares about what? He cares about Wisconsin. Yep, good. Anything else? He's authentic. He's not your typical politician, right? So that definitely comes through. And if there's one underlying message, certainly that's it, right? I'm not an actor. We're not professional actors, right? I'm authentic. But that's really the only thing you can come away from, right? It's funny, it's attention-getting, but it doesn't necessarily give you any of the substantive reasons why maybe you should vote for him. Okay, so let's contrast his positive ad with one of his negative ads.
this message.
A guy named Russ Feingold was the #1 maverick and independent in the entire United States Senate.
Not really. Feingold went along with all the other mavericks for the government takeover of healthcare. He fell in line along with all the other mavericks voting for the failed stimulus. And he was really mavericky when it came time to increase the debt limit. Let's get serious. Russ Feingold a maverick? Not anymore. He votes the party line.
Okay. So what do you learn in this ad? It's not about Ron Johnson, right? And that's typical for an attack ad. But you do learn some substantive things about his opponent, Russ Feingold. In particular, what do you know? Yeah, the things he's in favor of or against, right? So what in particular? Anybody remember what they mentioned? Obamacare. Exactly. Raising debt. Yep, exactly. Substantive lines, right? Now, some of you may ask, and it would be a fair question to say, okay, but right, they're giving you what he voted for and against, right? These are factual things, right? It's not as if they are making up information. They're giving you actual substantive reasons why maybe you may or may not like Russ Feingold. That's actually very typical of negative advertising, and they tend to be much, much, much more substantive than positive ads. So if I were to say, like if we were to mandate, all right, citizens don't like negativity, let's have a world in which there is only positive ads. I will tell you, we will see a lot of flags and a lot of puppies. But we will be no better informed when it comes to Election Day, right? Something to think about. Okay, the other trend that we've seen in advertising is increasing involvement of outside groups. And here is where we do very much see the role of Citizens United, but not only Citizens United, it's a multiple federal Supreme Court rulings which have laid the foundation for a new and a changed campaign finance landscape that encourages outside interest groups to get involved. So in presidential primaries in 2012, we saw a skyrocketing influence of them. Interestingly, in the House and Senate, we saw slightly different trends. So group advertising in 2014 was definitely higher than it had been in previous cycles, but not at a historically high, not at a historical high prior to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. In contrast, though, you see in the Senate, we have seen skyrocketing influence of advertising. And the other thing is that both parties and outside groups' ads are more negative. We do tend to see much more negative ads from those two sources. They're not necessarily just negative personal, right? So these negative ads do tend to be more substantive, but that may also lead us to some additional points of concern. Dark money, right? So if you haven't heard the term before, dark money, current regulations do allow for groups and anybody who is nervous about their names appearing anywhere, they allow groups to hide their donors. So these are mostly 501c organizations, otherwise referred to as social welfare or nonprofit organizations that do some political activity. And super PACs are supposed to be fully transparent, right? So super PACs have to disclose their donations to the Federal Election Committee. But there are some super PACs that only disclose 501c organizations, right? So if you have a super PAC that only discloses 501cs, and then the 501c doesn't disclose, right, you actually don't have a way of fully tracing where that money is coming from. And we have seen both 501cs and not fully transparent super PACs becoming more involved in elections, which poses a problem for citizens who want to know where the funding and where the money is coming from. The Center for Responsive Politics has tracked increases in dark money, and we have been seeing more and more of it come in election cycles. And if we look at advertising in particular, we also have seen increases in dark money. So the darker bars are presidential, and you see a skyrocketing amount of dark money in the 2012 election cycle, and also a similar increase on the congressional side. Okay, so that sets the stage for trends. Let's talk a little bit about 2016, right? We have two candidates, one who is very typical, maybe not liked, but very typical, running a very traditional campaign by all standards, right? And then we have one candidate who, I don't know how best to describe to you, very, very unusual, right? So to give you some perspective about how unusual it is, what we tend to see, so the reason, again, why we tend to see increasing number of ads is because presidential candidates are usually well-funded, their campaigns are very sophisticated, and they tend to try, right, not to allow the other candidate to have huge advantages on air. Because we do know that if one candidate has an advantage on air, we do tend to see poll movement in the direction of that candidate, right? So a typical race would look something like this from a Bush-Kerry, right, where each one of these dots is a media market. And so what you tend to see is in places where one candidate is advertising, we tend to see the other candidate going up. Maybe not in equal numbers, right, because candidates are not always equally well-financed, but we do tend to see a very positive correlation between the two, okay? Here's Trump versus Clinton this summer, right? So this is data through July, but I can tell you that even if we put all ads aired through August 18th, this graph would not change. We have never, ever, 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 ever seen anything like this in the history of modern campaigning, right? No presidential candidate has been absent from the airwaves for so long, right? And that has consequences. So Trump went up on air in August 19th to be exact. And we did see, so here's Romney versus Obama, right, in 2012. The solid line gives you the true 45, right, and the dashed line is a regression through. And so you see that Obama was out-airing Romney, right, and he was really out-airing Romney's candidate ads, and that's because Romney was really heavily reliant on outside groups in 2012 in particular. Contrast that with Trump, Clinton, right? And we do see Trump on air, right? And there does tend to see, we are seeing a positive correlation, right? So someone in his campaign finally at some point, right, is, okay, we need to put some things up on air. But obviously, he's nowhere near where Romney was at the same time. If we look at, advertising advantages, so these are the geographic maps, and anywhere in red is where Trump had an advantage, and anywhere in blue is where Clinton had an advantage. We do tend to see, some places where he has had advantages. So Colorado in particular in August and September when the Clinton campaign and then Priorities USA eventually says, we're not advertising here anymore, right? Her lead was sufficient, or so they thought, and so they pulled out. Most recently, we know that Trump has had advantages in Wisconsin in particular, but really everywhere else was dominated by Clinton. And so as a consequence, right, of Trump being off air, we have seen quite a large decline, right? So these are the pro-democratic ads, including all sponsors, right? And so we have seen about a 30% decline in Clinton ads so far, and a 60% decline on the Republican side. So Trump is airing many, many, many fewer ads. Interestingly, if you look, so this was right after Trump went up on air, the light bars are candidate airings, and so you see for this particular period that Trump actually sponsored as many unique creatives as Romney did, but he didn't have any outside group help, which again was key in Romney staying close. Tone, right? So I've told you that tone has only been increasingly negative over time. If you had to guess, right, has this cycle been in advertising negative or positive? That would be my guess too, right? It's been an unusually bruising campaign, right? And certainly I can show you some ads that will back that up. So just for fun, let's take a look at a couple of them on air.
Donors, Hillary Clinton called tens of millions of Americans deplorable.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
People like you, and you. You know what's deplorable? Hillary Clinton viciously demonizing hard-working people like you.
I'm Donald Trump.
Okay, so classic Trump attack ad. Let's look at one for Clinton.
I'm Hillary, and I approve this message.
Look her right in that fat, ugly face of hers. She's a slob. She ate like a pig. A person who's flat-chested is very hard to be a 10. Does she have a good body? No. Does she have a fat? Absolutely.
So you treat women with respect?
I can't say that either.
All right, good.
Okay. So the one thing that is really unusual this cycle that I don't think we've necessarily seen before, but we didn't track it prior to this cycle, so I don't have hard numbers for you, is use of candidates' quotes directly in ads, right? These two ads are unusual for what we typically see because they simply straight up take both candidates and take quotes from them and then use them for their own purposes, right? Particularly, some of them are especially effective, but very unusual. And so if I were you, and if I were guessing, right, is 2016 been more positive or more negative, I also would have said, you know, it seems pretty negative out there. But if we look at actually the ads that are on air, they've been more positive. They are only slightly more positive than 2008, but they are the most positive presidential cycle we have seen since we tracked it. And they are most positive in particular because Trump, off air through all the summer, finally goes up on August 19th with only contrast and negative ads for a month, right? So he didn't air a single positive ad until after September 15th. But after September 15th, and the month afterwards, he was airing 50% of his spots were positive. Really unusual, right? Now, I can give you a couple possible explanations for this, right? So Clinton has always aired a mix of positive ads, and that's typical for a candidate strategy. Candidates overall, over the course of a campaign, tend to average roughly 50% negative ads. They don't shy away from negativity, but they do air positive ads. Part of it, I think, right, is that the news coverage has been so overwhelmingly negative, right? Both candidates are very much disliked, and there may be some benefit from being up in a positive way on air, right? So Trump in particular has had a couple ads in which he is featured. He also had an ad that was featured only Ivanka, talking about the importance of motherhood and what her father will do for women in particular, right? Interesting dynamics. Let's turn to the Senate quickly. So we've seen Senate advertising has been much more typical, right? So we've seen increases in Senate advertising. And when it comes to outside group activity, we've only seen a continuation of this trend line, increasing outside group involvement, especially, and that is driven primarily from Senate races. So this is an early graphic from races, but you see the 30% here, 35%, really hides how much group activity we've seen in Senate races. So Ohio and Pennsylvania, where over 80% of the ads on air were aired by outside groups. So again, that holds for both Democrats and Republicans, increasing involvement in groups. And before I leave you, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about groups and why we may or may not be concerned about their involvement on air. Groups are increasingly involved. They are heavily active. They are some of the largest advertisers. So in 2012, Mitt Romney and Obama were the top two advertisers in the presidential race. But the next several were groups, well out airing the parties. And the thing is, even though these groups were heavily active, most citizens don't have any idea who they are. So Crossroads GPS was the largest group advertiser in 2012. And just after Election Day, in a survey that we conducted, only 62% of the American public knew who they were. Anybody here recognize that name? Okay, yeah. Restore Our Future, Americans Crossroads, Priorities USA Action. Some of these groups might sound familiar to you, right? But most of these groups pop up for one election cycle and go away. So I'll tell you that even as a scholar of political advertising, I look at some of the names and I'm like, who is that, right? So I know if I'm having trouble doing that, the average citizen is too. Here's why it matters. Group ads, we can demonstrate, actually work better than candidate ads. So in an experiment where we take online respondents who come to us and are randomly assigned to a treatment and control condition, we show them the exact same ad. The only way the ad differs across respondents is in the paid for by line, where we tell you in one case that the attack ad was paid for by Todd Zink, a fictional politician, and in another case was paid for by the Center for American Democracy. I will tell you that the Center for American Democracy ad is more effective than the candidate ad. And that's in part because citizens don't like negativity, right? So if Todd Zink is seen airing a negative ad, Todd Zink actually suffers a penalty, a backlash to him as a person by airing that negative ad. But if the Center for American Democracy says the exact same thing, right, he's shielded from the backlash and he still benefits from the decline in negativity toward his opponent, Sean Hannah. Okay? Now, note, unknown groups work best. And it doesn't necessarily matter that the group is dark money or not, right? Because the Center for American Democracy, is that Republican or Democrat, or do you not know? It's very different than if the NRA or the Sierra Club were airing the ad, right? In the latter case, you actually have strong ideological cues that will help you sort out that piece of information, or Philip Morris, right, we were talking about earlier. You have strong ideological cues that can help you sort out that information. But most groups, right? So I was going to show you this ad, but we couldn't get it to work. We did a little parody, like, what do you do, right? Well, in a world where group ads work better, I don't know that I want to live in that America, right? I get it. We're all jaded about our politicians. We're all jaded about our political parties. But should a pop-up organization that I know nothing about, should their speech be more effective than a candidate or a party? I don't know. I don't really think so, right? So we put together a parody ad in an attempt to educate citizens about this issue. And the ad we said is paid for by Americans for an American America, right? Because these are what all the groups sound like. I'm not joking. They sound like they're for mom and apple pie. And so people are like, oh, great, yeah, these people are for me. I'll listen to them, right? I was giving the same presentation in front of a bunch of campaign finance lawyers, and one of them said, that group actually exists. Here's what we can do. First, I think it helps to pay attention, right? Pay attention to who's airing the ads, right? Don't necessarily believe everything anyone says. The other thing we know, the Supreme Court has held that it's within Congress's power to mandate more disclosure, right? They haven't done it, and there are powerful incentives on both sides of the aisle not to do this. But I will tell you that there are, and this is why the 50 states are wonderful as laboratories of democracy. The state of Massachusetts and other places have what are called top donor clauses. And if in the paid for by line we have to list our top 5 donors, that ad is no more effective. It's not less effective than a candidate or a party ad, but I can tell you that it is no more effective. So there are ways that we could work with politicians to make it so that outside groups don't necessarily have the same advantage that they have on air. The other concern that we might have is about the effect on the issue agenda, right? So outside groups come in. I don't have time to tell you all of these, but let's just say, candidates are being defined by an outside identity. There are concerns about organizations with the ability to marshal resources and focus a machine gun fire of ads at a particular message, right? Concern is outside group comes into a race and they take the issue agenda away from what candidates would want to talk about. So political scientists say, right, although political scientists disagree strongly about what sorts of policy messages should be shaped by the parties or by candidates, few would argue that interest groups should dominate, right? When interest groups frame the issues, attack the character, and otherwise run shadow campaigns, candidates are not responsible for the claims and the attacks and the ads, and therefore it's more difficult to hold candidates to the campaign promises when those promises are made by interest groups and not by the candidates themselves, right? So this may be a concern. But among groups, right, there should be variation in the extent to which a group is going to bring the issue agenda away from what candidates would be discussing. So in order to do that, we have to come up with more theory, right? So what about a group might make it more likely to take the issue agenda away from candidates? Well, we focus on 2 particular characteristics. The extent to which a group is single issue or multi-issue, and the extent to which a group is membership-based or not membership-based, right? And so as a quick way of illustrating, I will say that the Sierra Club and the NRA are what I would call classic single issue, right? They're both focused on one issue. Membership groups, they have large numbers of members that donate money for them to work on that particular issue. We contrast those with Priorities USA, which used to be an Obama super PAC and now is a Clinton one, and Crossroads GPS, which is run by Karl Rove, right? These are multi-issue groups that don't have members, and we might be particularly concerned about those groups because those are the ones that are becoming more and more involved in elections. But if we follow out the theory, right? Single issue groups have membership bases, right? And if you're a member of the NRA, or if you're a member of the Sierra Club, you probably wouldn't be very happy if those organizations went on air to talk about energy policy or to talk about abortion, right? Now, the NRA did some of that this cycle, which is unusual, and we can talk about that if you want. But they are more constrained, right? We argue, actually, they're more constrained in their messaging. They're constrained by their membership in particular. And therefore, that should lead them to less convergence with the candidates. No matter what the candidate is talking about, they can't go with a candidate on abortion. They have to stick to their issue. Whereas the multi-issue groups, right, are probably less constrained. And it turns out, if we come up with a measure of convergence, that's actually what we find, that the multi-issue groups are more likely to converge with candidates than single-issue groups are. Now, you might ask what the baseline is, and I'm nearly out of time, so I'm just quickly going to say, if we assume that party organizations, right, are the ones that should be working with candidates, and we compare the multi-issue groups to the party organizations, we see that they approach and in some cases exceed the amount of convergence that we see between the candidate and the party organizations and the candidate and the multi-issue groups, which suggests to us that if we're going to be concerned about issue hijacking, then we're probably more concerned about the single issue membership groups than we are the new groups that are involved in elections, right? The good news for us is that those tend to be the least active on air, with the exception of the NRA this cycle, which we can talk about. So in terms of groups, cost aside, and I can talk more about cost, there are large incentives for groups, dark money or not, to get involved in elections. Groups are more negative and less transparent on average, and even when they are fully transparent, right, citizens don't know who the heck anyone is, right? And so they are more influenced by those ads. We know that disclosure and disclaimers can help level the playing field, but the issue agenda effects, right, may be less worrisome. And so that at least is one good silver lining out of all of it. When it comes to 2016, the presidential race is clearly an anomaly, right? But I do also think that it's a case that 2016 will be seen as some sort of turning point for television advertising in particular. It's not going away for sure. We're seeing increasing numbers of it on the Senate side in particular, but there's no doubt that there's much more money going into digital than there ever has been in recent cycles. But there's also no signs of group advertising letting up. And so in that group concerns, we might also have additional disclosure and additional undue influence concerns. And so I'm happy to talk about any of these things in Q&A. Thank you very much for your time.
So we'll take a break for about 2 minutes to those who have class at 6. To excuse yourself, I encourage everyone to remain for what I'm sure will be a very interesting and fascinating Q&A.
So you said earlier that negative ads are generally more substantive, and negative ads have increased over time. So I was curious as to why the public seems to be the same, or if not less informed now than they were 50 years ago, for example.
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's no evidence that the public is any more informed than they used to be. And I will say that advertising can never make up for the deficit gap that we see among the citizenry. Part of the reason why advertising as well is not going to close the gap as well is because it tends to be targeted. It's very highly concentrated, right? So if you're in California, right, or if you're in Connecticut, you're not seeing very many presidential ads, right? Now, the presidential race is also not the best example of the informational effect of negative ads because we tend to have many sources of information for the top of ticket races, right? But advertising can be more beneficial down ballot in particular. But advertising, as you know, right, is limited to 30 seconds. So it's never, ever going to be able to provide an informed citizenry. The way my advisor used to talk about it is, if you think about advertising as being an informational supplement, right, it hopefully drives some people, right? And again, we're talking a small sliver of the public that actually is paying attention, because most of the public, right, it sits on one side of the partisan aisle, and no amount of advertising is ever going to change their mind. But in the ideal world, it's going to take that small sliver in the middle and jog them into going out and seeking additional information. But you're right, and the information gap among citizens is one of the most, I think, worrying concerns of most democratic theorists, right? It is and it isn't, right? So on the one hand, we could say, well, people are not that informed, and most of them don't go out to vote, so we don't need to worry about them anyway, right? On the other hand, we might say, well, we really would like a more informed electorate that is very participatory. And it's one of those trade-offs that I talk about a lot in my Intro to American Government courses. Thank you for your question.
I was wondering, you were talking about positive, negative, and comparative. Mm-hmm. If you looked at the emotional frames within those categories, mm-hmm. and if any of those emotional frames resulted in greater political efficacy among audiences.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So I would say the most amount of scholarly attention in the field of political advertising has been to the question of whether negativity in particular turns off voters, right? So what's the effect of negative ads on turnout? It's not efficacy per se, but it's related to efficacy for sure. And the initial studies suggested that negativity turned people off and probably decreased turnout. Almost all of the work that followed that, which looked outside of the laboratory. So one of the problems with experiments is that it's somewhat artificial, right? You see an ad and then you're asked a series of questions, and one of them is, are you likely to turn out? Well, it's 2 seconds after you saw the ad, right? So that has some problems. But most of the research that was conducted after that had good reasons to question it, right? And there were people both who said there's absolutely no effect, we can't uncover an effect on turnout, but there were also some scholars, my advisor in particular, and his colleagues, that also suggested we actually see higher turnout in the places with negative ads, and he's the one that had the more extensive data that we use. I would say we're talking scores and scores and scores of studies. In the big meta-analysis that has been done most recently, the scholars concluded that there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that negativity decreased turnout. But there's still an open question as to whether or not it actually increases it, right? If anything, they suggest perhaps it has a slight mobilization effect. And then the most recent work by a scholar, Yana Krupnikoff out of Stony Brook, actually suggests that perhaps the effect of negativity depends on timing. And perhaps both sides of this literature are correct in the following way. So if you are someone who has not made up your mind and you encounter negativity about a particular candidate or a particular issue, you might be mobilized to go out and get additional information and therefore to better inform yourself about what to do. But after you've made your decision, right? So if you've decided that you are going to vote for Donald Trump and you encounter an ad that attacks him, now presidential candidates are, not the best scenario for this. So let's move down ballot. You've decided, you're going to vote for a particular representative, okay? But then you encounter some new information that's negative about that candidate. What her work suggests is that you're not actually going to reconsider your vote choice at this point, right? Because you've actually considered it, you've thought a lot about it, and you know for whom you wanted to vote. But the negative information at that point might make you less enthusiastic about actually making it to the polls. And so there's a lot of compelling logic to that explanation, and I think that probably is correct. And so then it matters, right? How late how late of a decision maker are you, right? And it also, I think, helps explain why partisans in particular are so turned off by the negativity, right? Because they see negativity from, in some cases, February through election day, and they already know for whom they're going to vote. And so the negative ads aren't doing anything other than just making them super frustrated.
It sounds like your research is almost exclusively candidate focused. So I wanted to ask you, in California, we have a lot of propositions for
Yes,
going to.
tons
Right
of
now, I
them.
know Proposition 61 is the worst, but the amount of money poured into that campaign is fascinating. Do you work in that area as well?
We track that ads, but I haven't done any work on that. I will tell you though that we can say that advertising does matter quite a bit for referenda because again, in the logic of advertising will matter more as you know less about a particular race should apply to ballot races, right? And so in that mode, the more ads you see about a particular issue may make you, more informed on the issue and be more likely to have an opinion about it.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the future. More and more people, of course, are cutting the cord.
Yep.
So one, just a factual question is, are there different ads in the digital market than what we see on TV?
Yes.
And so is that the future then? More targeted ads and less of what you've shown here, broadcast ads that are attempting to reach as you said, the sort of moderate voter.
Yeah.
So will ads look different 10 years from now?
For sure they will, and they already are, right? So in the digital sphere, there's a lot more flexibility. So on TV, right, we tend to see the modal ad is 30 seconds long because that's what you tend to buy. You can buy 15-second ads and you can buy minute-long ads. And we even saw Obama, run a full hour-long special in 2008, I think it was. But online, there's, the world's your oyster. You can do whatever you want. And so we already are seeing there is Clinton went up with a digital ad that is 5 minutes or something long. And it's not until the very last 30 seconds that you actually hear her name. So it's this biographical story about a mother whose daughter was born deaf. And it takes you through, their stage of life and all these other things and how she struggled to get health care, but then she found about children's health insurance and got her daughter on the program and all these things. And then it's not till the very last 30 seconds that I found out that Hillary Clinton made this possible. And, so yeah, we see lots and lots of different things online. Online advertising is not necessarily more likely to come from different sources. So one of the things we did the last few cycles is track all the ads that were loaded to YouTube that had mentioned both candidates. And the vast majority of them were from candidates and parties and traditional interest groups. They were also the ones that were viewed the most. But there are a few special ones, what I would call, new tech organizations or those sorts of that did have some breakout spots. So there was an Obama Girl ad, and there, I'm sure you've seen some of the parodies that take cartoons of the candidates and those sorts of things. So those definitely. But yeah, so some of the concerns. So we write about this in our book a little bit in one of the chapters. Online ads are so much harder to track, right? And as a scholar of campaigns, I'm sad for the future because we just won't have the same kind of information that we have. And the candidates and the campaigns don't even have the same information because, and if you've ever been in the room with, so I've worked with Google and other places where they've been having digital discussions about what to do about their online advertising. But they, if you are a campaign and you want to advertise, right? These are closed. Like Facebook in particular has a closed market, and so Facebook it will be the new venue for most digital advertising. People will still go to Google and other places, but certainly that is one closed atmosphere. But campaigns will give them a full list of who they want to reach. The organizations, due to privacy, aren't going to give back to the candidates and the campaigns who actually gets to see their ads. So they'll upload the list, and the best that the campaign will get is you have a 70% match rate. And sometimes they'll say, oh, you have a 70% match rate, and 40% of them are female. But they're not going to give you much more information than that. So the campaigns will seed their own lists with their own supporters so that they're sure that the ads are actually being distributed, right? But they don't necessarily know who's seeing which ad and who's not seeing which ad. The other thing is, the advertising will be hyper individualized. So television has always been geographical, right? So as a resident of a particular media market, you would see the same ad as your neighbor. But addressable advertising, which is already available on satellite and is being rolled out on Comcast this year, can make it so that you can be identified inside a media market as, you know, an individual in the 35 to 55 range who, you know, has a particular preference, right, or watches a particular type of show, and you will see a different ad than your neighbor does. Now, that's great for the campaigns, right? And certainly there's evidence already on television that they do try to target their messages, right? So the ads that are appearing on Home and Garden Network, right, HGTV, look different than the ads that you'll see on CNN or the ads that you'll see on the local news. Creative, the content part of the creative has always been the bottleneck. So I don't see a ton of innovation on that. I think that will be the wave of the future. There'll be even more individualized creatives. But the question, I think, for us as a democracy is it good if we all get an individualized campaign, right? Can we hold candidates accountable in the same way if they're saying different things to different people? And there's no mechanism for anybody to check, right? At least on television, we have a legitimate archive of all the ads that have been aired that anyone can go through, right? And anyone can be sure to hold a candidate accountable. You said this, or you said this, or you did this. We just don't have, there is nothing like it. And your individual experience online will be different than even an individual, you know, like they can actually try to target differently even inside a household. So my husband and I, if we have different devices and we have different browsing experiences, which we do, right? Google has, it's actually, this is one of the things I always tell my media and politics students, go into your Google profile, your advertising profile, and you can see all kinds of things about who Google thinks you are, right? And your advertising experience will be based on who they think you are. And I do think some of the small d democracy benefits that we have of political advertising, right? Campaigns try to reach particular people. And if they could, they would avoid anyone who doesn't turn out, right? The byproduct and the benefit for small d democracy of them not being able to do that is that there are informational benefits of them touching people who wouldn't otherwise be touched in this environment. As we move to a more hyper-targeted campaign experience, that's going to become less and less likely. And the question is whether or not we think that's okay for our democracy. I'm not sure we can do anything about it, right? But certainly that's definitely where we're heading.
Hi, I'm wondering, you may have answered this already, if so, I apologize. I'm wondering how much message control Senate candidates have given up this year because of Donald Trump, and maybe to a lesser extent, Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
So Trump says something, and the next day, Senate candidates are asked about it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think about this? How much of that is playing out in the air wars?
So the advertising environment is one way in which candidates can try to maintain, right, control over their messaging, because they can't control the press event where the reporter says, and what do you think about this? And they do have to address it. So there's no doubt that that message control veers off course, in particular in these races. I think what's interesting, and I mentioned this briefly, but we are seeing many more ads. So it's typical for advertising to go after an incumbent president as, you know, so-and-so stood with him, or so-and-so did this, or I've stood with him, or, you know, what have you. But I haven't in the past seen a lot of advertising that brings in the presidential candidates themselves. And we expected on the Senate side in particular to see Democrats really trying to pin Donald Trump on Republican Senate candidates. And as of our last press release, which was October 13th, we'll have another one in a couple weeks, 2% of the democratically sponsored ads actually mentioned Donald Trump, whereas 14% of the Republican ads were mentioning Clinton, right? And some of that is I think, smart on Republican Senate candidates' behalf, right? Because some of the things that they're saying aren't necessarily, you know, Hillary Clinton is the worst. What they're saying is, if in a Hillary Clinton presidency, I'm an effective check. I'm the check that you need, right? And so it's certainly painting her in an unflattering light. But I might have expected to see the reverse, right? The Democrats are doing more of the pinning of Trump on Republican candidates, and so far we haven't seen that. But there are lots of ads down ballot. There are ads up in Colorado in particular in the competitive races where they'll mention both, right? So a Republican incumbent in particular is saying, I don't like Donald Trump, I don't stand with him, but I also don't like Hillary Clinton. And when she's in the White House, right, they're just taking it for granted. When she's in the White House, you need me because I will stand up to her. And we haven't really seen that kind of thing before.
Hi, I just have a question about, and I don't know necessarily if you're able to track something like this or if you have before, but have you guys seen any difference in the types of negative ads? For example, the ad that you had first shown, the negative ad, was more of an attack on, oh, you raised taxes and debt and all that, whereas the two presidential candidate ads were attacks on more character.
Yep.
Qualities of the candidate. Is there a difference in that, and how has that played out in the race thus far?
Definitely is a difference. So my colleague, I'm actually on leave this semester, so not teaching the campaigns and elections class like I normally do, but my colleague who is always has an exercise where he has the students go and try to code the ads about substance. And he was commenting because he was putting them together for the class. They lack substance, most of them on the presidential side. They're really much more about, typically, citizens don't like negative ads in part because the negative ads that we have in our heads or what we think about when we think about negative ads tend to be the character assassinations, right? But character attacks are actually the least frequent ad that we see in general. And we do see them skyrocketing this year, especially on the presidential side. So I do think it is different. And I think that's in part why we tend to see citizens thinking this campaign is the most negative thing we've ever seen, even though on television advertising that isn't empirically the case. But there is a difference. And I do think this campaign and this is just unusual for that reason. And I think part of it, to be somewhat fair to both presidential campaigns, is that we haven't had a race in which the candidates have been so well known and so disliked, right? Early on. And so I think part of it is that I can say this about the Clinton campaign in particular because I will bet you that they've actually tested it. I can't say the same about the Trump campaign because I'm not sure that I don't know what their strategy is. But certainly they must be thinking that these sorts of character issues are better for them than the actual issues, right? And I have no other explanation for why they would be doing it that way, aside from they just want to keep attention on that. But certainly in her positive ads, she is going after some substantive issues, but again, they only make up about 30% of the ads that she has on air. So it is different. The effects, it's tough to say. It's really tough to say. I think this cycle has been so anomalous and so unusual and so hard for most political scientists. As a profession, there are people who stake their, that do election forecasts, well before the campaign gets started. And that's some of the impetus for, do campaigns actually matter? Because in most cases, the forecasts that happen before a campaign even starts end up being accurate, 80% accurate. And so if that's the case, do campaigns even matter at all? Well, as a campaign scholar, of course, I would tell you that they do matter. But again, they usually matter at the margin. But I think this is a case where the campaign does actually really matter. And in a world, if you take an alternative universe, right, and Donald Trump is not the Republican nominee, I actually think that if you had Marco Rubio or even Jeb Bush at this point, the world would be a lot different, and the polls would be a lot different at this point in time.
Erika, thank you very much for being with us this evening. there's no question that elections and the electoral process are the foundations of our democracy, and the work you're doing is so important. I love the fact that you're engaging students in the research, and particularly at a primarily undergraduate institution. We love undergraduate research in support of that, but we really appreciate more of the public service that you're doing to keep us informed and to help us make better decisions. So thanks to you and thanks to your colleagues. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.